Some places don't fade when you leave. They wait. The fields around Burley, Idaho look quiet. Just potatoes, stubble rows, and irrigation lines under the sky, but the soil remembers. It holds everything pressed into it. Secrets, pacts, and the kind of silence that grows sharp with time. Jeff Bauer thought he'd left all that behind. His stepfather, the trailer, the dungeon hidden beneath the fields. He built a life far away, trading wheat dust for Hollywood lights. But one call after 30 years split the past wide open. Ross Kerrigan, his oldest friend, with 4 words. They're digging it up. What do you do when silence has been your only shield? When the pact you made as a boy still waits for you in the dark with teeth? Welcome to Dust and Echoes. My name is James Cawley. Each week I tell you one of my original stories, drawn from the places where memory won't stay buried, where the land holds its breath, and where the past keeps its own time. This is a story about what happens when a secret buried for 3 decades claws its way back into the light, and what it takes to face the ghosts you thought you left behind. I call this story Dead Memories. Jeff Bauer sat at the keyboard with his hands resting on the keys, listening to the note fade into nothing. The screen in front of him glowed blue with a half-finished score, the cursor blinking as he tried to find the chord that would really tie the film score together. Outside his window, Los Angeles shimmered, all neon haze and steady hum. He should have felt at home here. He had it all. But it didn't feel like home, more like a borrowed life. The phone rang. It startled him, not because of the sound, but because of the name that lit the glass. The caller ID said, maybe Ross Kerrigan. A name he hadn't said aloud in years, maybe decades, but a name that came into his head daily. His gut churned seeing that name, and the word that came to his mind first was death. What could be the reason for him to be calling? Ross's mother, maybe. Or his sister, maybe. Maybe he's at the hospital going through old numbers because there was no one else to call but an old childhood friend. People do things like that in times of grief. But he knew down deep inside he'd been waiting for this call. He knew it would come someday. He answered, and before he could say hello, Ross spoke. Jeff? It's Ross, are you there? The voice was rough, not from the too many packs of smokes, but from silence, loneliness, and too many bottles of cheap whiskey. Yes, it's me, Jeff said. Before he could ask why he was calling, his childhood friend said the one thing he had feared the most. They're digging. Just those 2 words. They came flat and heavy, like a stone dropped into a well of stagnant water. Jeff gripped the phone tighter. What are you talking about? The land. When Dad died, I lost the crop lease, and the landowner sold the farms. Developers are out there with the new owner. I saw surveyors, stakes in the dirt, orange flags. They're going to find it. A long pause stretched. Jeff could hear his own breath in the receiver, shallow and uneven. You need to come back, Ross said. His voice cracked, then steadied. I can't do this alone. Jeff pressed his hand against his forehead. He remembered that summer in the fields where sprinklers cut rainbows in the sun, hazy sunsets, and the smell of fertilizer. He remembered things he had buried deep, along with the smell of wet earth and canal water. You were there, Jeff, Ross said. Quiet now, almost broken. You were there. Jeff looked around his apartment, the awards on the shelf, his tuxedo lying on the floor where he took it off after the premiere, the skyline outside his window like a city painted in light. He had left Burley behind for good all those years ago, and what happened there? He had a new life now, That was the promise he'd made to himself, to move on. But guilt doesn't care about promises. "All right," Jeff said at last. His voice sounded steadier than he felt. "I'll come. I'll fly out first thing tomorrow." The line was quiet, then Ross exhaled. "I'll be at the motel. I live there." Jeff remembered the motel and told him he'd be there tomorrow. When he hung up, the room felt too quiet and his hands began to shake. For a long moment, he just stood there, listening to his own heart. It beat slow and heavy with dread. He packed without thinking. Jeans, boots, 2 shirts. His body moved while his mind stayed back at the phone call, circling the words again and again. They're digging. He found a red-eye flight that departed at 5 a.m. into Boise, then Pocatello Regional Airport. He'd rent a car and drive to Burley from there. He tried to get a little sleep, but it didn't come. The early drive to LAX was a blur of headlights. He caught his connection in Boise. Sitting on the smaller aircraft, he stared out the window as the city lights dropped away, and the dark landscape of central Idaho stretched out below. A flight attendant offered him coffee, and he took it, and still looking out the window into the darkness, drank. It scalded his tongue. The cup shook slightly in his hand, though he told himself it was the turbulence. When the plane touched down at Pocatello's small airport before dawn, the air outside was sharp and cold, and the sound of a far-off train echoed in the stillness of the morning. He forgot about how crisp and sharp the fall air could get in Idaho. He picked up a rental car at the counter and pointed it toward American Falls and then onto Burley. The road carried him south through long fields of stubble from recently harvested wheat and old barns leaning into the wind. When Burley came into view, it looked small and tired. It hadn't changed much in all these years. It was just as he remembered it. Storefronts with faded paint. Signs that hadn't been changed in years. The same Magic Valley diner his mom took him to. The same hardware store, the same garage. All holding on to the past and old times somehow. Jeff pulled the rental over to the side of the road. He got out. He looked east across the fields to where the old trailer had been, now long gone. He couldn't see any sign of digging out that way. No little orange flags tied to wooden stakes, no machinery or trucks, just empty fields and old trees where his trailer once sat years ago. The wind bit his cheeks and he got back in the rental car. He kept driving, deeper into the town he thought he'd left behind forever. Towards the motel he knew would still look the same. Towards the childhood friend he hadn't seen in decades, and towards the secret they hoped would always stay buried. The Kerrigan Motel looked the same as it always had. Low rooms, peeling paint, a sign that worked when it felt like it. Jeff parked beside a sun-faded Bonneville with a dented quarter panel and shut off the rental. The morning had burned off the last of the cold. Ross came out before Jeff reached the office. He'd put on some weight in the middle and lost it in his face. His eyes were red at the rims. He wore a jacket that used to be brown and boots that had seen a lot of miles. There was a way he held himself, like a man trying to stand up straight for someone watching from a distance. "Hey, Jeff!" Ross put out his cigarette on the motel room's cinder block windowsill and put the half-smoked butt into his jacket's front pocket for later. He pointed towards Jeff's rental. "Let's talk in the car. Mind if we take yours? I'd say we could take mine, but it's just a little low on gas." They got into the car. Ross smelled like he slept in an ashtray. "Let's head out to where your old trailer was. I'll show you what I saw." They drove with the windows cracked. Jeff took the highway east, then a frontage road that turned to dirt. Fields on both sides, harvested and left to stubble. Ross started pointing out the window. Jeff stopped the car. "There. See the flags? The orange ones. Do you see them? That's why I called you. They were out here. Orange stakes, paint on the ground. Survey people. Jeff looked out across the fields. No tire tracks, no surveyor's paint or boot prints in the muddy field. He kept that to himself, but felt relief that Ross likely had blown this out of proportion. He seemed paranoid. And Jeff, looking at his ticks and scabs across his arms, can't help but wonder if maybe he'd gotten into meth. Okay, Ross. I'm here and ready to help do my part in this. What's the plan? What are you thinking? Jeff asked. Ross looked out towards the lava flows and lowered his head. I know neither of us wants to go back down there. But if they do start to develop, to move dirt, they might find it. So we need to go back, today, and take care of it for good. They kept driving down the dirt road on the edge of the fields and past a gate hanging open on one hinge. He pulled off along a strip of lava flow. Basalt that shouldered through the field from long ago, eruptions now separating the farmland. The soil thinned and the weeds got tall. That rock had stopped plows for 100 years. It was why no one had built here. If something was going to stay put, this was a good place for it. Jeff killed the engine, and they got out. They checked the road out past the field's edge in the distance, out of habit. No Cassia County sheriff crawling along. No farmer watching from a tractor. Nothing but wind and grass, and the tick of the rental car cooling. They stepped from the road and into thick brush. It came up to their waist, and then as they walked deeper in, it was coming up to their chest. Dry stems scraped at their jeans. Seeds and cockleburs stuck to their socks. Jeff felt the temperature change before he saw anything. A cool line of air moving over his shins. Right there, Ross said, nodding at a shape in the weeds. Jeff's stomach sank. He did see it. Part of him hoped it didn't actually exist, that it was just some childhood dream, a story he made real through his imagination. But he knew it was real. So very real. They had called it the dungeon. Ross bent and pushed aside dried tumbleweeds and last year's dried grass. Jeff knelt and helped move a large slab of cement that covered the entrance. A downward-sloping culvert of concrete showed itself, old, pitted, with rusty bits of rebar peeking out where the edge had broken. The crawl sloped down. It was tight for a man, but a boy could get through pretty easy. Inside, the pipe widened and ran to the junction, a small room-sized space, its floor covered in dirt and debris. They had called that little room down there the dungeon, because kids give names like that to things that scare them. Jeff rocked back on his heels, kneeling, looking inside. The smell coming out was old water, mouse nests, mud, and the hint of something foul. It was not strong, but it was enough to pull a line through his memory. These old tunnels were abandoned and forgotten. Farmers all started using the new canals and modern, more reliable pipes. Most of the side tunnels were collapsed, but only this one left, and that little room down there. They sat quiet a minute. Jeff swallowed hard. His stomach turned. He leaned over and spit in the dirt. It wasn't much, but the taste in his mouth was the same as it had been once before. Ross looked at him. Want to hear my plan? I think I know how we can make all of this go away. For good. Jeff wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. Tell me your plan. He kept his eyes on the darkness at the end of the culvert. He felt 12 again. Knees scabbed. Shirt stuck to his back. The whole world narrowed to a circle of light on concrete. As Ross began to tell Jeff about his plan to make what they did disappear for good, Jeff closed his eyes. His mind went back to the summer where being a kid stopped forever, and the reality and bitterness of the world took hold of him. In his mind, he went back to when it happened. July 1992. The summer of 1992 came on fast, like it always did in Burley. One day the wind still carried the bite of spring, And the next the sun was heavy and high, pressing down on roofs and gravel lots until everything shimmered. Heat waves rose off the highway, and the blacktop stuck to your sneakers if you stood too long. The air smelled of cut alfalfa, manure, and fertilizer. Jeff was 12 that summer. He lived with his mom and new stepfather in a sagging trailer east of town amongst the fields. Parked on a plot of land the farmer let them stay on in exchange for the stepdad moving pipe mornings and evenings. It wasn't much, but his mom had called it a fresh start. It was something she needed. A new beginning. The last few years had been tough for both of them. Jeff's dad was killed in a train accident at the rail yards a few years back. The trailer didn't feel like a fresh start. It felt old the day they moved in. The walls were thin and dented. His stepdad's boots were always by the door, caked in dried mud, and the house smelled of stale beer and whiskey most nights. That man, his stepdad, wasn't liked in town. Folks gave Jeff's mom sympathetic looks, wondering what she saw in him. He was a bully with a record of fights, run-ins with the sheriff, and more enemies than friends. But Jeff's mom had been lonely, worn down from grief. To her, even being with a cruel man was better than being a single mother, all alone. Even at a young age, Jeff remembered not understanding this. Ross Kerrigan was Jeff's neighbor, if you could call it that. His dad leased most of the land out there, including the field the trailer sat on. Ross was 14, 2 years older, taller, always tanned from working outdoors. He had a crooked grin and a kind of restless energy that made him seem older than he was. When Jeff and his mom pulled up with a borrowed pickup and boxes of clothes, Ross was the first person to show up and offer them help. By the next day, Jeff and Ross had become best friends. On the day their lives changed forever, Ross showed up barefoot as the sun rose over the fields, and mourning doves cooed at the edges of the gravel road. Ross was holding a duct-taped fishing rod and his dad's old tackle box. Jeff was waiting for the toaster to pop up the tart he was cooking for breakfast when he saw Ross coming up the drive. He pushed open the old screen door leading out to the hand-nailed and wobbly wooden porch. "You want to go fish?" Ross asked, grinning, holding up the pole. Jeff shrugged, already pulling on his sneakers. It was always something with Ross. Fishing, exploring the old potato cellars, shooting at sparrows with a slingshot. Anything was better than staying inside with the sound of the TV and his stepdad's rambles about the government and insults after half a bottle of whiskey by lunch. Saturdays meant that Javier, the other farmhand, moved pipe in the morning. Having Saturday mornings off meant that his stepdad always got extra drunk on Friday nights, and then he kept it going all day until he had to relieve Javier and move pipe that night. Jeff knew being scarce around the place on Saturdays was a good thing. He missed his real dad. Mom didn't talk about him anymore, even when Jeff asked her questions about him. She was afraid it would make his new stepdad angry. But Jeff missed him and hated this new rough man who didn't pay him the time of day and hit his mom when he got too drunk. They walked along the edge of the fields, past the long rows of pipes stacked like bones. The sprinklers were already hissing in the distance, long arcs catching the sun. "You ever hear about old tunnels?" Jeff asked. Ross squinted. "Tunnels?" "My stepdad was talking about it last night, drunk as hell. Said it was another dumb government thing back in the old days out by the lava fields. Poured a bunch of money into digging tunnels for irrigation back in the 20s, then abandoned them when the dam came in." Ross stopped, looking at him sideways. "My dad did tell me about the old tunnels once. We were out there, dumping some rocks that we picked out of the field. He said they were dangerous and to stay away from them." Ross thought about that, chewing on the inside of his cheek. "I completely forgot about that. Too many rattler nests out by that lava flow, too. But I know where it is." His grin spread. "You want to see it? See if we can get inside?" Ross opened the old tackle box, rooted around, and held up an old flashlight. Of course Jeff did. They cut across the field and through an overgrown ditch, swatting mosquitoes. They had to run and jump over the stagnant water in the muddy canal and watched for snakes as they crossed the jetty of old lava flow, separating the fields. Ross led the way down into a bramble of overgrowth and weeds. He stopped, looking for something beneath the chest-high brush. He crouched and started pulling aside dead grass and huge tumbleweeds. Beneath the overgrowth was the edge of a round concrete opening, almost buried by years of debris and mud. They pulled all the brush aside and moved some chunks of concrete to reveal the cement culvert entrance that sloped downward into darkness. "There," Ross said, a little proud, a little nervous. Jeff crouched beside him. The air coming out was cool and smelled like damp dirt and mouse nests. His stomach flipped, but he didn't want to look scared. Ross crawled down into the culvert first, without hesitation, setting the tackle box and fishing pole down next to the entrance. His shoulders were scraping the concrete as he slid inside headfirst, holding the flashlight. Jeff heard the echo of small rocks tumbling and the movements of his friend below. He got on his stomach and followed, heart thumping. The crawl wasn't as tight as it looked, but then the tunnel widened at the bottom of the slope. They emerged inside a larger concrete tube, roots dangled down, and water dripped somewhere unseen. The pipe was collapsed completely in the other direction. They hunched down, moving forward, and came to a junction. There, the tunnel opened wider, into what looked almost like a little room. The junction room once had other tunnels branching off, but they had all caved in too, leaving rubble, dirt, and this little room down here in the darkness. This place felt hidden, a secret that the world had forgotten. Ross swept the old flashlight's beam across the small little room. He pretended it was a sword, swiping the beam back and forth. "Let me try," Jeff said, holding his hand out for the flashlight. He did the same thing, pretending to fight an imaginary dragon in the darkness. They both laughed. "That's it," Ross said. "We call this place the dungeon." They sat cross-legged on the damp ground, grinning at the name. "We are knights," Jeff said with a noble expression. "Defenders of the dungeon." Jeff laughed. The sound echoed off the concrete. For a while they fought in the half-dark, the hollow clack of old rotten sticks they found to use as swords filling the tunnel. They were just boys, caught in that strange middle age when you were old enough to know the world was cruel, but still young enough to believe in dragons. After a while, they lay on their backs, breathing hard, listening to the sound of water dripping somewhere far away. "You ever think about running off?" Jeff asked quietly. Ross turned his head. "Why?" "Where would I go?" Jeff shrugged. "Anywhere. California. Montana." Ross thought about it. "Wouldn't change who we are. A place doesn't define who you are." The words stuck in Jeff's chest, though he didn't know why. Ross looked over at Jeff in the darkness. "You saying that because of—" He paused and continued with caution, not wanting to ruin the day's fun. "Because of how mean your stepdad is?" Jeff just looked up at the darkness and then slowly nodded. They both sat in silence for a long time before leaving the dungeon. When they crawled back out into the daylight, the sun was already dipping. The fields glowed gold, and the sprinklers hissed against the horizon. Jeff felt lighter and heavier all at once. They didn't know it yet, but the dungeon wasn't just an old irrigation tunnel. It was the place where their childhood would end, that same night, all those years ago. The sun had burned low and wide across the fields by the time Ross and Jeff made their way back from the canal. Their shoes were damp from the ditch, jeans streaked with mud, and both boys were carrying the tired weight that comes after a day spent outside. The sprinklers had switched off, and the farmland lay still. Dusk stretched long shadows over the stubble rows. From the road, Jeff could already hear the television in the trailer and his stepdad yelling something at his mom. The tinny sound of sports commentators overlaid carried across the gravel like an argument you couldn't escape. His stomach knotted. Saturdays were always really bad. His stepdad had the day free until nightfall, which meant more drinking, more temper. The screen door hung open, letting out the smell of hot dogs boiled and instant mac and cheese sharp in the air. The boys heard his mom crying and crept up to peek over the plywood porch through the screen door. Inside, Jeff's mom was at the stove, stirring a pan with her back stiff and her movements clipped. She was sobbing. His stepdad leaned against the wall right behind her. He held a half-drained whiskey bottle in one hand, limply. His shirt stained with sweat and his boots still muddy from moving pipe this evening. His eyes were red and wet, his face slack in a way that made Jeff think of old dogs that bite without warning. He grabbed his mother's shoulder with force, and she turned to face him. She held her arm up in defense. That was enough. Jeff went in as Ross continued to watch from outside the screen door. His stepfather swayed, turning toward the sound of him opening the old door. "Where the hell you been, boy?" His voice cut across the room before Jeff could step inside. "I could have used some help out in the Southfield. Where the hell you been?" Jeff froze in the doorway. Ross, behind the screen, held still too, the way you do when a rattlesnake stirs and then rattles its tail. "We were just, me and Ross were," Jeff began. He tried to keep his voice even, the way he'd learned. "I don't care where you were. Now get over here and clean my damn boots." He held his unlaced boot out and motioned for Jeff to come take it off and clean the mud from it. Jeff didn't move fast enough. The man lost his temper and swaggered towards him. "When I say now, I mean now, boy." He tapped the half-drained bottle of whiskey against the side of Jeff's face. Not hard enough to break bones, but hard enough to let Jeff know he wasn't playing any games. But the sting lit his face hot and made his eyes water. His mother turned. She lifted the hot pan from the stovetop. "Stop!" The man, now red-faced with rage, turned. Ross was frozen outside watching. "Shut your mouth. The boy's got to learn to be a man, have some responsibility for his actions. Don't you question me." His words heavy with drink as he stumbled towards her. "You gonna hit me with that pan?" The words spit from behind his teeth. He shoved her back with one hand. She fell backwards and hit the counter hard, but catching herself on the edge. Ross stood frozen at the door, fists balled but unmoving. Jeff's heart thudded and he rose to his feet, still in a daze. Then came the moment that changed everything forever. The stepdad staggered toward Jeff's mom, raising a hand like he meant to bring it down hard. Jeff moved towards the man before he could think about it. He lunged, jumped, arms wrapping around the man's neck from behind, pulling back with all his weight. "Stop hitting her!" Jeff shouted. His voice cracked, high and wild. The man wheeled sideways, losing balance. Jeff let go as the man's large body fell backwards off balance, smashing his head on the corner of the big console television. A hollow thud that sent a trickle of blood down his temple. The man used the TV to clamber to his feet. Jeff backed towards the screen door where Ross watched. For a second, the man looked dazed, blinking. Then his face hardened into something worse. "You're gonna regret that, boy," he growled. His voice was low, steady, too calm. He pointed his shaking finger at Jeff, then at his mother. His eyes were glazed and full of hate. "I'll kill you first. Then I'll kill her." He stumbled quickly into the trailer's master bedroom. Jeff's mother was holding her side. He could tell she was hurt. "Go," she whispered. "Run, Jeff. Get help." The stepdad came back out. Jeff saw he now had the old shotgun in his hands. He worked the action with a snap, and the sound filled the trailer like thunder. Boom! The wood paneling to the right of the door exploded. Ross opened the door and grabbed Jeff by the sleeve as the stepdad pumped the shotgun, loading another round in the chamber. "We gotta go," Ross said as he pulled Jeff down the steps and towards the field beyond. The second shot roared as they bolted through the screen door. The blast tore a hole in the old door where Ross had been standing moments ago. His mom screamed from inside. The man threw open the door as he loaded another round and stumbled after them into the growing twilight. The boys ran across the yard, gravel stinging their legs as they stumbled, looking behind them. Another shot boomed. Jeff yelped as a few pellets struck his back, stinging more than cutting. "Where do we go? What do we do?" Jeff gasped as they sprinted through weeds taller than their waists. "Should we go to your place, Ross?" Looking behind as he ran, Ross shook his head. "No, my dad's not home. Just my mom and my little sister. We can't risk leading him back there." "The guy is insane, Jeff, and he's way faster than I thought he would be." We need to hide just until dark. The dungeon. Let's go back. Hide down there. We'll be safe there. After it's dark, we can sneak to the Johnsons' place and call the police. Jeff's chest burned, lungs aching. Behind them, his stepdad's voice carried on the wind, ragged and furious. You can't hide from me, boy! The boys crashed through brambles, burrs snagging their jeans. They reached the lava flow, the basalt rocks rising like a jagged wall against the fading light. They scrambled down into the brush, breath ragged, past the tumbleweeds they'd cleared earlier to reveal the entrance. Ross dropped to his knees first. Go! Jeff hesitated, his whole body trembling. The night smelled of dust, sweat, and the gunpowder still hanging in his hair from the shotgun blasts. They didn't have a light this time. Go! Ross shoved him. His stepdad was above, still calling after them on the lava flow. Ross hoped he would step into a rattlesnake den, but that was wishful thinking. Jeff slid into the mouth of the culvert, the cool air wrapping around him like a cellar door opening. Ross crawled in after, pulling one of the large tumbleweeds over the entrance as he went down, just as heavy boots crunched the brush above. They froze in the darkness, backs pressed against the damp concrete at the bottom of the entrance crawl, listening. The stepdad's silhouette filled the opening against the last pale light of the day. He just stood there breathing heavily. They tried not to breathe. Then, his voice came. It was a low growl, words slurred but clear enough to freeze Jeff's blood. I know you're down there. I'll bury this hole and tell him you two ran off. But first, I'm going to kill you both with my bare hands. He set the shotgun down outside the lip of the culvert and took his steel lighter from his pocket and flicked it on. The sudden flare lit his face, illuminating it twisted in rage, sweat cutting lines through the blood at his temple. He held the lighter towards them as he began to crawl forward. His large shoulders scraped against the narrow entrance. His breath came in animal-sounding grunts, labored and mean, as he crawled slowly towards them, blocking their only escape. The boys retreated, blind into the darkness down the connection pipe, inch by inch, until they reached the dungeon room. Jeff could feel the concrete trembling with the echoes of sound the man made forcing his way in. The circle of light from the flame flickered closer, dancing on the walls. There was nowhere left to go. Jeff could smell his stepdad before he saw him crawl around the corner. Sour whiskey and sweat. The man's heavy breath filled the tunnel, each grunt closer, louder, until Jeff could feel the heat of it against his cheek. The weight hit him hard, knocking him flat against the damp floor. The lighter flame flickered inches above his face, and behind it, his stepdad's eyes glared wide, furious and drunk, teeth clenched tight. One thick hand pressed down on Jeff's ribs, squeezing the air out of his chest. Jeff squirmed and clawed, but he couldn't move. He felt his ribs bend, and just when he thought they'd snap, his stepdad shifted, weight leaving his chest as he reached down to grab a chunk of concrete, jagged and heavy. He lifted it, breath hot in Jeff's face. Jeff thought, this is it. He's going to crush my head with it. Then, crack! The sound was different than the shotgun, smaller but sharper, like green wood splitting in a fire. His stepdad's eyes widened, mouth opening as a dark flood poured out. The concrete chunk slipped from his grip and clattered beside Jeff's head. The lighter went out, leaving only the smell of burnt fuel and blood. For a moment, silence. He found the lighter and flicked it on, and he could see Ross. He was panting and his eyes were closed. His hands were wrapped around a chunk of concrete, with a piece of metal rebar sticking out, which was now crushed into his stepfather's collapsed skull. Ross had swung it down with all his weight behind it. The stepdad slumped onto his side, shuddered once, and stopped moving. Jeff gasped, chest aching. He crawled backward until his back hit the wall, keeping the lighter open to illuminate the room. The smell of blood was heavy and raw, copper and minerals mixed with the dampness of the dungeon. Ross just sat on his knees. He didn't speak. He didn't look at Jeff. The two boys sat in the dungeon with the body between them, the dripping water somewhere in the dark, keeping time like a clock. Finally, Ross said, "We can't tell anyone." His voice was flat, steady in a way Jeff had never heard before. Jeff wiped his face with his sleeve, streaked with dirt and tears. "He was going to kill me and you down here. He was going to kill my mom." "I know," Ross said. "But what if they don't believe it like that? What if they say we murdered him? What if we are forever known around here as the kids who killed someone? My dad could lose his farm lease over this. What do we do?" Ross leaned back against the wall, eyes lost in the dark. "We make him disappear." They crawled out of the tunnel into the cool night air. The sky had gone black, stars sharp and endless. Crickets screamed in the grass. Jeff breathed deep, like he'd just come out from underwater. The shotgun lay by the entrance, forgotten. Ross picked it up, checked the chamber, and set it under his arm. They didn't speak as they crept back toward the trailer. From the field, they saw red and blue lights coming down the highway miles away in the distance. Jeff's heart dropped. Through screen door, he saw his mother standing in the kitchen of the trailer on the phone, crying, one hand pressed to her side. Jeff started walking towards the stairs. Ross grabbed Jeff's sleeve, pulled him back. "We can't just yet. One more thing we need to do. The police are coming. We don't have much time." Ross peeked through the half-destroyed screen and watched Jeff's mother go into the kitchen, spiraled phone cord stretching around the corner. Then he acted fast so she wouldn't see. He carefully opened the screen so it would not make a sound and grabbed the stepfather's truck keys from the entry table. Jeff shook his head. "What do we need those for?" Ross led them around the far side of the property to where the stepdad's truck sat, wallet and hat sitting on the bench seat. Ross opened the door, put the shotgun barrel against the floor and climbed in, and gestured for Jeff. "Get in." His tone was firm, not angry, not excited, just certain. "My dad's had me driving tractors since I was 8. Jeff climbed in, heart hammering. Ross started the engine, the old V8, coughing awake. He turned off the headlights and steered them down the dirt access road that cut through the fields. The truck rattled over the uneven ground, dust kicking up behind them. They drove in silence for 2 miles until the farmland ended and the earth broke away into the gorge. The Snake River roared below, black water glinting faint under the stars. Ross put the truck in neutral, rolled down the driver's window, and turned off the headlights before getting out. Jeff did the same and met him at the rear of the truck. "Help me push," he said. Together they leaned into the frame. The truck rolled forward, slow at first, then faster, bumping toward the edge and then over. For a heartbeat, it balanced there, stuck, front wheels hanging out over the drop. In unison, the boys slammed their shoulders into the tailgate. After the third time, movement. The old truck started to move forward. The rusted chrome bumper shimmered in moonlight before vanishing into the darkness below. The boys stood at the edge, breathless, watching the dark shape of the truck far below, bobbing and sinking slowly into the current of the river. Jeff felt his chest tighten. A sob caught somewhere he couldn't let out. Ross spat into the dirt. "But listen, we have to be on the same page when we get back and talk to the police. Do you hear me, Jeff?" In a daze, Jeff nodded. Ross continued, his mind working out all the angles in the moonlight. "We tell them we ran out to the bluff here and he chased us in his truck. We tell them we watched as he just flew off the edge in the truck. They'll find the truck in the river tomorrow. Think he did it drunk, chasing after us. If we don't mention we were anywhere near the dungeon, nobody will come looking down in that tunnel." Jeff nodded, though his stomach churned. "What about his body? It's not in the truck. That's why I rolled down the window." "They will think the current sucked him out," Ross said, looking down at the dark river. He then held out his hand. Spit packed. "We never talk about this. Not to anyone. Not ever." Jeff hesitated. Then he spit into his palm and pressed it to Ross's. Their hands gripped tight, sealing it. When they came back, the police lights were now flashing on the trailer. Jeff's mom was sitting on the steps, blanket around her shoulders, talking to the deputy. She looked up and screamed with relief as she saw Jeff running to her. She pulled him in tight, kissing his hair, repeating, "I'm so sorry, baby. I'm so sorry." Ross's dad drove up, got out, and Ross ran to him and hugged him tight. The sheriff asked them to come into the station for some questions and wanted to get them looked after by medical. Jeff's mom had filled them in about the situation, and patrol cars were already out looking for his stepfather. Ross spoke up quick. He was drunk. Mad. Trying to kill us, he tried to run us down in his truck. We ran out to the bluff, and Jeff listened to Ross tell the story they crafted as his mother stroked his hair and hugged him tight. The deputies exchanged a look, not one of doubt, but of relief. Everyone knew the man's temper, his drinking. By morning, a dive team that was called in had found the truck wedged against rocks in the Snake. The body was gone. They say it was likely washed downstream with the current. Their story was not questioned, and the whole town didn't doubt it either. They all knew the man was no good. The next day, Jeff's mom rented a cheap U-Haul, and they loaded up their few possessions. They were going to go to Bakersfield, California. His mom's aunt said they could come live with her for a while, until his mom could get a job and back on her feet. Before leaving, his mom stopped the U-Haul at the end of the driveway, Ross walking up the side of the road towards them. His mom smiled and told him to say goodbye to his friend. Jeff got out and walked over to where Ross sat down on the gravel and was scratching the ground with a stick. He sat down next to him. "So, you're leaving?" he said, not looking up from his stick. "Yeah, going to live with my aunt in California. Mom says we don't have anything here for us." Ross looked up, a bit hurt. Jeff continued, "But I'll miss our adventures and stuff. I'll come back if I can." Ross laughed. "It's okay. But hey, I just wanted to tell you so you know." He leaned in close and whispered, "I went back down there, into the dungeon. I covered them all up with rocks and stuff, just to be safe. Then I covered the entrance with rocks too." Jeff just nodded. He thought about how terrifying that must have been and felt thankful. Ross slapped him on the back and then stood. "Don't look back this way, Jeffy. I'll make sure our secret stays hidden. I'm not ever going to leave this town, I don't think. So go on. Have a good one. I'll miss you." He smiled and saluted Jeff and walked off. It was the last time he had seen or talked to Ross before the call decades later, and just like that, it was all over. Or so Jeff thought. And just like that, the years flew by. Jeff snapped back to the present as he listened to his childhood friend, now grown, explain his plan. "We get the bones, put them in these garbage bags, and throw them downstream in the river. If they ever are found, they will just think they found what washed out of that truck years ago. It will work." Jeff nodded. It was very well thought out, and he felt relief swell inside him. He was thankful for Ross and felt bad for doubting him after all he has done for him over these years. But he was still terrified of what they had to do down there. Ross pulled a battery-powered lantern out of the duffel bag he had brought. The weeds whispered around them. The highway was a faint hum miles away, and the dark mouth of the tunnel breathed fragrant, cold air into their faces. The smell, wet earth, mouse nests, and something else. A sour and rotted smell underneath. His ribs tightened, and his stomach pulled back into that boyhood fear. Ross stood beside him, jittery, shoulders hunched, his boots scraping at the soil. "Funny thing, though," Ross muttered. "After you left, I came out here again. Just to check on things, you know. Couldn't stop thinking about it." Jeff turned his head slowly. Ross stared into the weeds, eyes unfocused. "I went back in. Covered him up better. Rocks, dirt, whole works. Didn't want no dogs sniffing around or something. The smell down there was so bad. But I actually didn't mind it much once I got used to it. After that, every so often, I'd come back." He gave a little laugh, brittle and thin. "Caretaker, I guess you could say." The word thudded through Jeff. Caretaker. He remembered Ross telling him goodbye on the road, stick in his hand, swearing he'd keep the secret. And he had. For 30 years. Jeff swallowed hard. Why? Ross's smile was quick, his voice a bit too sharp at the edges. I told you. Because I had to check. I just had to see. Jeff didn't know how to respond. It seemed weird, but it still made sense to check in, he thought. He looked back down into the dark hole. Ross crouched, brushing back the last tumbleweed covering the culvert mouth. It was actually pretty interesting. I mean, like science-wise and stuff. Jeff glanced at him. What do you mean? What was interesting? He shrugged. Just like watching him turn into bones. You know, the process was interesting to me. Jeff felt his hand shaking on the lantern. He wanted to let it go and feel like that was okay. But he couldn't do that. This was too much, too weird. Ross told him he came back once just to cover the body. Now he's telling him how he came back multiple times, crawling down into that dungeon alone to look at his dead stepfather's decomposing corpse. That was insane. Ross lit another cigarette, the flame bright against his weathered face. He exhaled and pointed with the tip. Ready to do this? At this point, Jeff just wanted to get this done as quick as they could. Then, he'd be on the next flight out of this place. Let's just get this done fast, Ross. He tapped ash into the weeds, his eyes gleaming in the lantern's light, and smiled wide. Easy peasy. He's just bones now. It'll take us 20 minutes tops. Jeff stared at him. He remembered the night they pushed the truck into the gorge, Ross's voice steady as he invented their cover story. We'll tell them he chased us. We'll say he drove off drunk. Jeff had gone along then because he was 12 and scared. Now, decades later, that same tone had returned, and Jeff felt 12 all over again. There was something about Ross's smile that didn't feel right. Then he remembered the boots. The pair his stepdad wore moving pipe, thick soles caked with field mud. We can't forget his boots. Ross didn't answer right away. He flicked the cigarette butt into the weeds and ground it with his heel. Then he stood, stretching his back. They're still there. We'll get him bagged up, too. Ross clapped him on the shoulder, heavy, familiar. You and me, Jeffy. We started this together. We'll finish this together. You go down first and I'll push the duffel ahead so you can grab it. Jeff nodded slowly, though his insides rebelled. He started crawling into the darkness. Jeff inched ahead into the culvert on his stomach, one hand holding the lantern out ahead, the other feeling for a grip on the slick concrete. Cold air moved up the pipe like breath. Behind him, Ross pushed the duffel, inside plastic crinkling. Dirt and grit pressed through Jeff's shirt. The crawl angled down and then leveled. The lantern threw a weak yellow haze. Roots hung from the ceiling like string. Water dripped somewhere ahead in a steady beat. The smell hit him now. It was bad. He didn't think after all this time it would still be this bad. Keep going. Not much room in the pipe for us both now. I'll meet you in the dungeon. It's a straight shot, Ross yelled down. His voice sounded different in the pipe, flatter, close. Jeff turned and moved on hands and knees until the tunnel widened into the junction. The little room was still there. He stepped into the space and stood hunched. The lantern's light pushed the dark back just far enough to see shapes. The smell hit him full and he gagged, pulling his shirt over his nose. The smell was overpowering. He thought he might puke. The light picked out a low mound to his left. A mound of rubble covering a human-sized shape. He stepped closer. But then he saw another human-shaped mound of rubble just beyond it. Moving quick, he swept the lantern across the small chamber, turning in the darkness. A third mound was along the far wall. The dirt there was packed different, like it had been moved and set back. Ross crawled out of the line behind him, breathing hard, and stood. Jeff looked at Ross. What is all this? Ross smiled and scratched his head. The lantern illuminated a pair of boots that sat side by side. The thick soles caked in old field mud turned gray. His stepfather's. But what he saw next made his heart stop. Next to the boots was a bent child's bike on its side, front wheel crushed flat. Near the bike was a line of more shoes. Not a pile. A line neatly laid out. A few pairs of tennis shoes, some women's shoes, and a small pair with a cartoon on the side. 10, 12 pairs at least, in the dark side by side. He felt the room tilt under him. "Ross," he said. But nothing else came. Ross stepped past him, easy in the way someone gets when they've been to a place 1,000 times. He knelt by one of the mounds and brushed aside loose dirt with the back of his hand like he was smoothing a bedspread. Ross didn't answer right away. He stared at the mound, at his handprint in the dirt, and smiled a little to himself. "It started with your stepdad," he said. "I told you. I came back. Covered him better. Couldn't stop thinking about him down here." He looked up at Jeff, lantern light catching the wet in his eyes. "After a couple years, I picked up a kid hitching out by Eden. He had a sign that said need a ride to Boise, but he spelled it Boyse. Isn't that funny? I still got it. It's right over there." He nodded toward an old backpack near the back wall. Jeff took a step back. His heel hit a rock and slid, and he steadied himself with one hand on the wall. Ross stood. Then there was a girl on a bike out by Twin. The old man who ran out of gas out by the quarry. He gestured with his chin around the room, casual. You can still kind of tell which is which if you want to look. Jeff's mouth went dry. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you're the only one who'd understand." Ross reached down and pulled the duffel close. He unzipped it. The sound rasped loud in the small space. He pulled out a roll of trash bags, a coil of thin rope, a pair of tight plastic gloves, and set them down in a neat row. Then he reached deeper and brought up a revolver, a .357 Magnum blue steel scuffed to gray on the edges. He kept it low at his side. "And because you're a loose end, Jeff..." Jeff stared at the gun and raised his hand. "Ross." "You left," Ross said. "I don't blame you for that, I get it. You went to California and got yourself a good life. I stayed and kept the secret of ours and found a calling of my own." He nodded to the mounds. "When I thought about you out there in Los Angeles talking to fancy friends drunk after a award party, or to some doctor in a fancy office telling them about what we did, saying too much, it scared me. Kept me up at night thinking, you could ruin it all. Ruin me if your conscience decided to come up. You're my only loose end, Jeffy. And that is why I called you." Jeff felt all the air go out of the room. "We can still fix this." "Ross, don't!" Ross lifted the revolver. Not quick. Just steady. He pointed it at Jeff's chest. The barrel looked bigger than it should have. "It started with you. You ignited this all in me. So it needs to end with you. Close the cycle. You'll be the last." But the way Ross smiled at him in the dark made him realize he would never stop. He'd keep killing. He was a monster. Jeff glanced down at the floor near his boot. A chunk of concrete lay there, familiar, old, and jagged. A twist of rebar sticking out like a finger. The same one that had crushed into his stepdad's skull. He slid his toe against it, so he could find it in the dark. "Don't," Ross said. He cocked the hammer back with his thumb. The click was loud. "It will be fast, unless you fight back." Jeff knew it was now or never. He moved quick. He threw the lantern at Ross as hard as he could. Ross fired the gun. Bam! The sound deafening in the small chamber. His ears were ringing and time seemed to slow. The lantern hit Ross in the face and bounced, flickered once, and then stayed on, leaving them in hazy darkness. He reached down quickly and picked up the concrete chunk with both hands. Still half blind by the muzzle flash, he lunged towards Ross with it, ready to strike. Ross moved at the last minute and the rebar end grazed Ross in the side of the neck. Ross let out a scream and swore, and the gun went off again, just inches from Jeff's ear. Dust came down from the ceiling. He lunged again in the darkness and fell on top of Ross, pinning him to the ground. The gun clattered. Ross got a hand on it first. Jeff grabbed his wrist. "Stop," Ross said, voice tight, breath sour. "Don't hurt me, Jeffy." But despite the tenderness in his plea, Ross was still fighting to point the gun into Jeff's chest. Jeff drove all his weight down and twisted the gun, fighting Ross's grip. The barrel moved toward the ceiling, then down, then up again. Back and forth in small jerks. Ross was stronger than he looked. He pushed it toward Jeff's face, teeth bared, spitting. Jeff turned his head and felt the cold steel scrape his cheek. Ross pulled back the hammer, and the revolver magazine twisted, loaded another round into the chamber inches from his face. "Let go," Jeff said. He didn't recognize his own voice. Ross's eyes went wide and strange. "You made me this," he hissed. "You did." Jeff found strength he didn't know he had. He forced Ross's hand, and slowly it changed direction and was pointing at Ross's chin. For a second, they both stopped, breathing hard. Dust moved in the lantern light like slow snow. "Don't!" Ross cried like a child, a bubble of snot popping out of his nose as he sobbed in the dim light. Jeff could feel Ross's finger inside the trigger guard. He pushed and squeezed his finger in on top of it. "Jeffy, please." He looked into his childhood friend's eyes to see if the boy he knew back then was still in there. All he saw, looking back at him, was a monster, a killer, a murderer that was going to kill him down here too. "Jeffy, we can get me help. We can..." Jeff closed his eyes. He pressed down on Ross's finger on the trigger as hard as he could. Bam! Then it all went quiet. It was night when Jeff crawled out of the culvert into the cold air. He was covered in his friend's gore. He went to stand and fell to the ground in exhaustion. He rolled to his back and stared up at the star-filled sky. The world was still. It was then when it hit him. The whole weight of 30 years came up out of that hole, and it poured out of him all at once. He opened his mouth, and he screamed. That was Dead Memories. Written and performed by the author. Me, James Cawley. A story about silence and survival. About the weight of a promise carried from boyhood into manhood. And about how some places never stop holding their secrets until the day they're forced to let go. If that story spoke to you, you're in the right place. Every week here on Dust and Echoes, I share a new original story, just like this one. A tale from the places where silence bends, but never quite breaks. Please subscribe and leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts. If you'd like to hear more stories like this one, I'll be waiting right here for you next week with a new one. Make sure to check out my website, enterthedust.com, where you can listen to past episodes and get a sneak peek of the stories I have planned next. You can also support the channel by purchasing a paperback copy of one of my stories. If you know someone like us, someone who enjoys stories about the thing waiting, just out of sight at the bottom of the basement stairs, do me a favor and share this podcast with them. Until next time, remember this. Strength is never found in simply remembering what's been buried. Real strength is knowing you can handle it once it's all been dug back up.